Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Airmic Live 2021. My name is Julia Graham. I'm the Deputy CEO at Airmic, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this first in the Airmic Live series of this new year. Little did we know at the beginning of last year that we would still be discussing the whole story of the pandemic, but this is where we start this year. And I'm delighted to welcome a panel who I will explain the names of and what we're going to cover in a moment. But we're going to cover the subject of the pandemic crisis from two angles. The first angle is that we're going to look at what the lessons are that we learned from 2020. And then we're going to take a step to look forward to what do we use those lessons for in terms of how we face the future and 2021 and beyond. We are going to record today's webinar, so it will be available if you wish to revisit and relearn some of what is being said, so it will be available to you. And I'd also refer you to the handouts that you will find on the left-hand side of your screen, and particularly a paper that has been submitted by Crawford on responding to pandemic-related events. And this is some of what our speaker, Benedict Burt from Crawford, is going to be covering later. So how are we going to approach today? Well, we've got a fantastic panel, and I'd like to introduce you to that panel. First of all, Benedict Burke, who is Chief Client Officer, Global Client Development at Crawford. If I just give you a little bit of background, Benedict joined Crawford in 2003 as Managing Director of its UK general insurance business, having previously held the position of Chief Operating Officer at GAB Robbins UK. Prior to this, and being appointed as Chief Client Officer, Benedict was Head of Global Markets, responsible for developing new claims solutions and third-party administrator services. Benedict served as an advisory board member of the CII Claims Faculty for 8 years and was president of CILA, the Loss Adjuster Association, in 2015, and remains chairman of its Professional Conduct Committee. Benedict, welcome today. Our second speaker is Ludo van der Heyden, Chaired Professor in Corporate Governance and Professor of Technology and Operations Management at INSEAD. Ludo has been Professor of Technology and Operations INSEAD at the university since 1988 and has been the INSEAD Chaired Professor in Corporate Governance since October 2010. With colleagues, he co-directs the International Directors Programme and the Modern Governance Programme in Banking. Again, welcome Ludo, and welcome back as Ludo joined us at the pandemic seminar that we ran at Airmic Fest earlier in September last year. And on to Philip Songhurst, Director at Control Risks. Philip is responsible for leading risk, resilience and security consulting across Europe, Middle East and Africa. In this role, he advises multinationals and government organisations on strategic risk, governance, resilience and transformational change. An area of focus includes the risk and opportunities brought about by digitalisation, data analytics and technological change. Philip, again, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again today. And last but by definitely no means least, David Lanfranchi, Risk Manager, CSM Sport and Entertainment and an Airmic member. David is London-based with international responsibilities. He has a deep understanding of key and emerging corporate risk issues. He's facilitated collaboration in the creation and presentation of original workshops and white papers in conjunction with industry forums, including Airmic, RIMS in the United States, and the London Business Interruption Association, the LBIA. And David, I understand you are also a former loss adjuster. So we have two loss adjusting professionals here today. David, also a big welcome back from me. Thank you very much for being with us. So the approach that we're going to take today is that we're going to run through a number of short presentations, starting with Benedict, then moving through to Ludo, then Philip, and then David. And following those presentations, there'll be plenty of time for us to deal with questions and answers, remembering those two focal objectives that we have today of where did all of that happen in 2020 as we look in the rearview mirror and think, goodness me, what was all that about? And then as we start to look forward, thinking more about, okay, we understand a little bit better now what that was all about. What is it going to mean for us in 2021 and beyond? So without further ado, I'd now like to pass over to Benedict, who's going to walk us through his presentation. Benedict, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Julia, and thank you, Airmic, for your kind invitation. Colleagues, it's my belief that the impact of COVID on the insurance market will cause a paradigm shift in how the sector operates. Whilst it's too early to describe with any form of clarity what the new norm will take and will look like, the developments that shape it, I think, are becoming evident. And whilst it may take years for the societal impacts to filter through to the insurance market, I think we know now that at the microeconomic level, we're clearly facing a global recession. There'll be significant corporate insolvencies. We'll see a decline and a change in the nature of workforce. And fundamentally, the speed of recovery by industry and nation will be variable. But for the insurance industry, the sector, a contracted global marketplace will inevitably bring a decline in gross written premium, perhaps due to many things, but certainly diminished exposures, plus a reduction in the investment returns for the carrier markets will place a greater pressure on their profitable underwriting. At your buyer level, I see the introduction of more rigid terms and conditions, perhaps with more rigid and prescriptive wording. I see higher deductibles becoming the norm and scope of cover may contract. I think also there will be a greater onus on companies to demonstrate visibly effective risk management practices and in the event of claims, loss mitigation measures in order to secure and complete successfully those sort of renewal negotiations that you're now undertaking. There's no doubt transitioning to this new market norm will be challenging, but I think a considered and planned approach, close collaborations with trusted partners will be critical in making that transition as smooth as possible. At the global loss adjusting level, the more immediate industry impacts my business has seen has been in significant increase in volumes in travel claims. We've seen a rise in event cancellation and postponement claims, particularly in the sporting and entertainment industries. Credit and surety, cyber, machinery breakdown, particularly following restarts, were clearly evident over the last 10 months. Sadly, we've seen also a rise in fraudulent claims, both at the commercial level, including potentially some at the significant corporate level. But as you all know, the most significant impact that I think the industry has seen has been in business interruption related claims. The issues that you'll have all read and are no doubt fully aware of have reached government level agendas, particularly in the UK, in the US and Australia. You know, in the red corner and the blue corner, we've seen the market and corporates and brokers look at and expose critical issues around wording, the lack of clarity in particular. I think there will be an industry-wide reassessment of that wording, and I'm sure that's going on right now at your renewal stages. There's certainly, I anticipate, being a surge in pandemic-related exclusions. Whilst the full implications of certainly in the UK, the Court of Appeal judgment is yet to be determined, we know that the Court of Appeal has sat, and I believe that their judgment will be handed down this Friday. As a business, Crawford has been working with clients to help them address the surge that we anticipate may come. And in that respect, we've created some technology and some realignment of our adjusters to enable them to deal with the increased flow into them following notification, which I think will emerge from the appeal. No doubt with other competitors of Crawford, arrangements are in place, and I think we've been successful to date in that planning and in the implementation of strategic responses with our client base. Adjusters have been adapting to the new operating environment. Just like the insurance industry as a whole, we've gone through a period of significant change and reassessment of how we do things. Traditionally, as you know, a core part of how our sector functions is on-site risk inspections and hands-on loss adjusting assessment. You know, being on site, talking to people, working with people is a core of how we've worked. We've had to change that over the last 10 months. And we've been able, certainly as a business, to leverage a 5-year investment plan aimed at digitalization of the customer journey. And in this respect, we've worked also with a number of our corporate clients. We've been able to accelerate and simplify at the same time our processes, and the technologies that we've used have been fundamental to that. It's been critical in the way that we've been able to deliver for our customers over the last 10 months. Those sort of areas that I'm touching on include remote claims handling capabilities, self-service applications sent out to the insured, virtual technology. We have 360 walk-through technology with estimating tools that can be worked from remotely by the adjuster from the desk. And critically, we've created a BI tool for claim assessment and fast-track settlement, which is fully utilized in the field. Over and above, we've been working with clients and corporates around other additional COVID-related services. Our business, Crawford Contractor Connection, has set up a network of deep cleaning and decontamination specialists, which emerged following the event and was quickly stood up. Our building consultancy business has identified and worked with clients and corporates to enable them to deliver a safe place, a re-entry strategy for a safe workplace. Certainly, we anticipate having to relaunch that post this particular lockdown in the UK, but that's been a worldwide solution put in place. And our TPA business, Broadspire, has worked with its clinical management team to help corporate clients deal with their pandemic needs and their well-being of their employee base. I think as an industry, we all therefore need to continue to think about evolving. And the adjusting sector recognizes that there will be changing dynamics between the insurer and insured relationship. And brokers will be very much integrated into working through those challenges and finding solutions. And we're happy to stand with them to do that. We think those dynamics need to be considered in an open and constructive framework. But the sort of areas that we see emerging and will continue, I think, to become relevant is, I think, loss negotiations, the challenge around loss negotiation, and particularly the interpretation of wording, I think may become less generous. I think the refining in the scope of coverage on renewals will also create challenges. I think there'll be an increased burden of proof on insureds to demonstrate quantum, and the causation will require stricter examination by loss adjusters and other experts. I think there'll be an increasing importance of corporates being able to demonstrate those risk management credentials that I talked about earlier, and there'll be a much greater focus on pre-loss scenario planning and how those step plans are put in place and how effective that planning will be in the event of a claim. I think loss adjusters can play a more proactive role in that macro system, in those negotiations. I think we can help corporates demonstrate risk management capabilities in the context of claims. Certainly, we can design and support as an industry pre-loss scenario and the planning around that. And I think we can also assess scope of coverage and test policy wordings, all of which I think should be part of our pre-loss risk assessment and claims management. Fundamentally, as a business, we've also been looking after our people. For all of us, our people are our greatest asset. So certainly from our point of view, we've had a wellbeing program in place since March of last year. That's involved internal and external speakers discussing motivation, financial health, our business health. We've shared almost on a daily basis over 100 updates have been issued centrally by the business around our strategy to cope and the financial well-being of the business, to build confidence with our people. We've appointed over 20 well-being champions across the world to support colleagues. And we have a new online training program implemented around people's well-being and health. And certainly, we'd be happy to talk to anybody on the call who are interested in what we've done as perhaps a case study. I think the claims management industry as a whole has a potential to play a much more strategic role in working with corporates in the context of the consequences of this pandemic. I think as an industry as a whole, the claims management industry as a whole needs to look at its talent base, particularly evolve that talent base in specialty and industry verticals. We've seen a lot of claims in particular industry verticals requiring specialist knowledge, and that stretched us at some points. And I think the industry needs to respond. I think, again, we need to look at the demographic issue in our overall succession planning, focusing on training and development. I think the industry needs to forge ahead with the technology tools, the enablers to the digitalized world. We as a business have done, I think, well, but we've a lot more to do. And I think the claims industry as a whole need to work with corporates and carriers and brokers around further involvement. And I also think we need to look at data and understand how we can capitalize on the wealth of data that's in the industry to support the analytic needs of and assist in the creation of business solutions to the corporate markets, all the way from workers' comp solutions to NatCat. So I think fundamentally and in summary, it's beholden to our industry to continue to enhance its relevance, bolster its strategic position within the industry, and to develop solutions that add real value to you as ultimately the consumers of the industry product. I think with a great willingness and with that collaboration that I talked about earlier, we're capable of doing that. And certainly that's the journey I want to take my business on. So at that point, Julia, I will pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Benedict. I think we need to fast forward a couple of slides and move on to Ludo, who is going to cover, keep going please, that's it. Ludo, over to you. You're going to cover the paper that we referred to before and perhaps fast forward us ahead a little. So Ludo, the stage is yours.
Yes, thank you, Julia. So I think this paper was presented last time. It's also available on the web, so I will not go over it again. I would say that this, what's important, I think, is just making the point that process is fundamental, and that process requires discipline, which is the willingness of people to work with the process. And I think the part of the process that is important are the 5 steps, which is engage people on the framing of the issue. What is the issue? And I think this has been sort of a big debate. I think that's still not over. Is it health or is it economy? And the inability to sort of say it is health and economy, these things are aligned, and make that very clear so that you don't create antagonism, I think is still sort of not very clear. I think on exploring options, I would say this is what business has done extremely well. I mean, everybody is impressed with the way the pharmaceutical industry has come out with solutions, vaccines, and also treatments. And I think Benedict, I think what I would underline, I think is very forceful as well in terms of the services, the insurance. So I would say in terms of exploring options, business really has done fantastic, and I think has become sort of the major leader of the fight. As an illustration, which is a bit negative, is that the CEO of Pfizer refused to go to the White House event to announce the rollout of the vaccine. He also presumably withheld the news of the vaccine because he didn't want to interfere in US elections. So I think that is sort of extremely good. The number of people motivated and engaged in exploration of options, I think is fantastic. I would say then the issue is the explanation. And I think in the explanation, one needs to act, which is delays are very costly, and delays are costly I think this is the insurance question. It's you know, let's be prudent today as opposed to hope for a better tomorrow. I think that is sort of, I think, what has been missing. It's not sort of, do we have the right answer, but are we prudent enough? Because this is an insurance, sort of an insurance issue. So I think that's on the explanation side. On the execution side, I think I would say, because the explanation and the setting of how the battle will be won, I think, has not been very clear. I think we have execution problems, and I think I would still say that the biggest execution problems are at the level of compliance with the process, with decisions, and also, you know, sort of being unclear about the scenario. And I think that's where the chaos occurs. So there are execution problems because there is not a clear scenario which is sort of, you know, led by the government and by the health authorities. And then I will finish with the evaluation side. What have we learned from this? I think we're still learning a lot, I think, and we still don't know enough. And I think one of the things we need to learn is, first, this is, I still think framing it as a war against this virus is the right framing. You know, this is not sort of a small issue. This is a very deadly issue from many dimensions. And it goes from a health issue to a sanitary issue to an economic issue to a social issue. You know, number of single women in Japan has all-time highs for suicides. So the damage, this is, in my view, is, I would use the issue of the war with the conclusion that, you know, at the time of war, you don't do politics. And politicians should step aside, or basically, you know, there should be a lot of discussion in Parliament. But you know, that noise should stay within Parliament. And I think the scientists have been terrible as well, because they've been debating in public. Now, I'm an academic and we love debates, but that is amongst us when we understand that people are discussing hypotheses. But you don't go wild on the internet, you know, sort of saying, what is your view? And I think the scientists should have more discipline in terms of when they become policy makers or policy instruments, you know, to have a professional code for scientists if you get into the politics debate. But the real issue is, in this pandemic, get the politicians out. You know, this is a bit wishful thinking, but I think for me that's a big learning. And I think the US, I think, has been sort of a great example, but Belgium as well, which is the politicians, basically, when it becomes political, things change. And this is true in Switzerland as well. So when there is no clarity, it becomes chaos. So this is not chaos induced by the virus, but it's chaos induced by the lack of clarity and consistency in the political statement. And I think that links with the war. I would say, for me, the other lesson is globalization. This is the paradox. It's a global issue because it's a global pandemic, and it needs a global response. And I think even in Switzerland, which has a very confederal nature, very decentralized nature, you know, when the cantons aren't aligned, you know, you have chaos because people are traveling across the cantons. So there is a need for global governance. And even in Switzerland, you know, most people feel that the confederal government has not been strong enough because of this tradition of decentralization. We've seen this in the US very, very strongly, where, you know, there was no alignment and no coordination. I would say the last thing I would say is probably for me the biggest lesson is more influence for the regulators in many, many ways. I mean, regulating the scientists who shouldn't in this war, you know, say whatever comes through their head and start making arguments. That should remain within the scientific debate. But the problem with the internet is everything becomes transparent. And so I think we're going to have a bigger role for regulation, I think. And that is what is amazing now, is that it is actually Facebook and Twitter that are actually regulator, which is the biggest virus of them all, which is Mr. Trump. And it is actually amazing how business is now entering the regulatory arena. So that's going to come out much more strongly, and we need that regulation, which is, you know, you should do no harm. I think that is the real issue, which is, you know, the freedom of speech is second to the first principle, which is do no harm. And I think in the academic community, you have debates in order to get closer to the truth. But in that debate, you should not do harm. And I think that's why academic debate should be closed, to initiated people and not go into the policy arena too quickly. I think these are some of the lessons. There's so much to say. I will finish with a good statement. In my view, whatever it's worth, is I think the combination, this is the good scenario, the combination of herd immunity and vaccination will lead to that is the big hope, will lead to a reduction of the pandemic effects, and then things will gradually come back down to normal. So I think herd immunity, which was the Swedish strategy, is actually what we're going to, what's going to solve it, but induced by the vaccine.
Ludo, thank you very much indeed. Now, in the true tradition now of Chris Whitty, next slide, please. So I'm going to move to Philip. I could see you nodding vigorously, Philip, when Ludo used the analogy of war. I'd like you to sort of talk about your 3 themes for future resilience, which you have in front of us, and perhaps to develop some of the observations started by Benedict and then developed by Ludo. Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Airmic, and good morning, everybody. So yes, I think so far Benedict's very much touched on the sort of industry perspective around risk and insurance, and Ludo on that macro global perspective. So my take is a little bit more around the organisational perspective. And we've been lucky at Control Risks over the last 6 to 12 months to be working with a number of global organisations, and that's important because I think when you look at the lens of the impact of the COVID pandemic, that lens has caused a variety of impacts depending on the size of your organisation. And a lot of the comments I'm going to go on to talk about have been for sort of mid-sized to larger corporates. And I think there's a question out there around, what has been the impact for smaller organisations, and especially in highly impacted sectors such as retail, which I'm sure we'll come back to as part of the panel discussion. I mean, the themes we see in front of us, so leadership, people, and intelligence, and by intelligence we mean essentially risk intelligence, were the themes that we started discussing with an Airmic group of enterprise risk leaders back in early June, end of May, early June in 2020. So what I wanted to do is revisit some of those themes and questions we had at the time, and really pick up on that and see what's changed since then. And once I've done that, I'll come back to the question of, so what does that mean going forward, which will hopefully feed nicely into David's summary and also into the panel discussion. But essentially, there were 3 topics we were discussing in the early days of the pandemic, and by early I mean May in 2020. And that was around leadership. So how will leadership need to adapt to the new normal? How can leaders ensure that they're making the right speed of decisions? And how does that decision making, work operationally, strategically? Then from a people perspective, it was around how do you make resilience more people focused? We're all used to seeing resilience as part of a process, as part of a system, but how do you embed that and make sure that people are being looked after? And we're starting to see, I think now more than ever, the impact of some of those mental health issues on the workforce who've been isolated, working from home, or just put under additional stress from an organisational standpoint. And then also the question was, do BCM, CM, resilience experts, risk experts, do we have the right skills and expertise to deal with a pandemic, and has that proven correct? And then finally, the risk intelligence piece was very much around, do we have the right data? Can we use that data to make decisions? And some of the questions around that robustness of data and the quantity of data available. Now since that time, we've actually run 2 significant surveys. The first one being with Airmic, some of the colleagues on the call today might have seen in October last year, which was a pandemic report. And then the second, our own Control Risk Global Resilience Survey, which we ran in Christmas. and both do give similar themes. So in terms of leadership, effective leadership is still regarded as the most important resilience principle, and over 71% of respondents to Airmic survey in October classify that as their top 3 priorities that their organisation has been focusing on. Now, the challenge with that was striking the right balance between involvement of senior leadership and involving them in strategic versus operational decisions, and making sure that decisions weren't knee-jerk reactions to the data, but actually considered timely and effective. And I think actually kind of stepping back, the government has in many ways started to walk that drumbeat much better in the last 3 to 4 months of data first, then decision making after, in my opinion. And then interestingly, the second survey on a similar theme from the Global Resilience Survey indicated that actually moving on, a lot of resilience professionals had a positive response to the pandemic in their businesses. So we wanted to unpick that, because to me it's surprising that a third of respondents would see that actually there was a positive outcome to some of the pandemic. So we unpicked that, and what we found in the data was that those organisations and people who had good, strong crisis management, resilience professionals in place to help manage the pandemic at the organisational level actually freed up additional time, business resource elsewhere in the business to deal with other aspects of the pandemic outside the crisis. And that meant that actually organisations were allowed to get on with their day jobs while dealing with the crisis if they had the luxury of resources in terms of crisis managers and specific resilience teams in their organisations to deal with it. So it was clear from those answers that from a leadership perspective, that crisis-specific leadership really was correlated with strong resilience and positive capability from a business perspective. So that really underpins the leadership side. And as I said, I'll come back to the so what. In terms of people, in terms of competency, it appears from both the surveys we ran that actually there's high levels of confidence that resilience professionals have had the right competencies to deal effectively with the pandemic, and especially in terms of risk awareness and something Benedict brought up earlier in terms of scenario planning skills. 85% of respondents said that they believed that they did have the right skills and from a risk professional standpoint. But what was missing, the missing component, was how then some of those skills in terms of operational decisions get lifted to the strategic level of the business and outside the classic siloed view of risk. How does that risk therefore impact broader business decisions? So that stems on then to, or flows on to the other concern raised around people, was that the longer term structure of organizations, although it's been managed well during the pandemic, still isn't set up for long-term remote working. Now, in our most recent Global Resilience Survey, 90% of the respondents felt that actually companies had improved and business had improved, again to Ludo's point, really taken the bull by the horns and improved significantly their way of operating remotely from a technological platform. Actually, that was very, very positive. 90% of those respondents were positive with the way their organizations were dealing with that. It stemmed back to the nature of the crisis, which was very much an all hands on deck, people first, business second, that many organizations took in their approach to the crisis. Now, obviously, this is a unique crisis, and it will come back to one of my final points later, but actually, because COVID impacted so many organizations at the same time globally, there was a lot of goodwill between suppliers, contractors, owner organizations and employees and employers that has been part of building this good resilience response. And that's something which is quite interesting, because I think we can get used to the pandemic, but if there's another crisis that comes along, it'll be very, very different. So building out the process, which Ludo talked about earlier, is critically important. And my final point was just around around data, risk intelligence, and some of the themes we've seen. I mean, early on in the pandemic, it was clear that organizations were struggling with the right data to manage decision making on the footprint of the pandemic, the speed of transmission, and the impact to their businesses. And actually, respondents to the surveys indicated that they relied heavily on UK government sources for risk intelligence, also other third-party sources such as the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Research Centre, while less than half of those respondents relied on more tailored advice and guidance, such as risk advisors or insurance advisors. Now, interestingly, that quickly changed over the life cycle of the pandemic in terms of availability of data has significantly increased, as has the accuracy of that data, which has helped enormously organizations dealing, especially with supply chain issues around strategic sourcing, moving the right sources to the right place, avoiding lockdowns at borders, etc., etc. So that is something which I personally and we personally didn't necessarily expect, the speed at which data would become available. But then, of course, that's caused an additional problem, which is almost too much data out there to manage. And then the question is, how do you filter that data effectively to make sure that those decisions are made in a timely fashion and using the right data? So it's very much around structuring the future data, not only for this crisis, the pandemic, but others. So I'm conscious of time. I will finish with this, with the big so what. So I think looking at each of those three themes, the so what from our perspective is that we learn best by doing, and that's clearly the outcome over the last few months, is that organizations and businesses have got very, very good at dealing with the pandemic on an operational standpoint with their people and processes. I think the opportunity now for risk and resilience professionals is to use that platform of goodwill and excellent work that's been done over the last few months to continue into the future to make sure that crisis, resilience and risk is at the top of senior leadership's agenda, that the good practices that have been built up are maintained. And I think one of the key challenges, as Benedict alluded to, if we do go into a downturn and organisations are stressed commercially, how do you balance out the resources required to manage good resilience from crisis through to security, with the need to reduce costs commercially? How do you balance out, outsourcing some of those resources potentially to keeping that full team in-house to make sure you are covered effectively in the future? I think that'll be the challenge that organisations will face as we move over the future now for the next 2 to 3 years. So Julia, that's really all I wanted to say, and hopefully that sets some of the context.
Yeah. I think that's a very good segue between what Benedict was talking about and what Ludo was talking about, because Benedict, I'm going to move on to David in a second to add his observations before we move to Q&A. But Benedict, what you were describing at your business is in effect a complete repurposing of A, the profession, and B, your business as part of that profession. Looking, that could almost be your slide that Philip has used there of leadership, people and intelligence, because that's very much a lot of what you covered. And we'll come back to that in a moment, because in effect your business is repurposing itself, which I think is a lot of what we're going to be seeing, and a subject that we with Crawford are going to be working on a great deal in 2021. So great setting of what your case study is in effect, and what Philip is describing. So David, turning to you, you've been very patiently waiting there. David, what's your perspective of this? I mean, I'm not going to say what's the answer, please sum it up in 5 minutes, but what are your observations about looking backwards and then looking forwards in your organisation?
Well, I think first of all, it's been fascinating listening to Benedict, Philip, and Ludo and their perspectives on things. Benedict, I'm kind of conscious that the insurance industry looks to itself, but from a client's perspective, there was not a great deal of good positive news out there. Claims will be looked at more carefully. We need to be investing more in risk management. the amount of cover we can get is likely to be narrower, and the subtext in a macroeconomic environment is that costs might go up. So that left me feeling particularly cheerful. Thank you. Ludo, I very much agree about the importance of process. Look, for us, we're a creative business, and we have to balance, I think, within our core support functions. And when I talk about core support functions, I mean legal, finance, people and talent, risk, and IT in particular. Process is pretty important. But I think one of the big lessons that we've learned and have been reminded of through this is the importance of giving our creative people freedom to try things, to keep experimenting, to keep making the mistakes, and to learn from them, and to provide our clients with creative solutions in difficult times. So process is important, and clearly in the context of the conversation we're having now around risk and crisis, having a good foundation in process is critical, and I'll come back to it. But in a creative industry, we have to be very careful not to strangle our key selling points for our clients, which is to go out there and to do things differently, to be creative, to push boundaries, and to be brave when we're doing that. Philip, I think that the thing that really struck me was the goodwill piece you mentioned. Goodwill is the glue that's got us all through this, and that does make it a very unusual crisis. More often than not, we plan for events that impact, on our business or on our geography or on our sector. Most planning hasn't been around a global event that impacts everybody to a greater or lesser extent, and I think the fact that it has done has provided that goodwill and has really supported a lot of businesses through that. So look, lessons that we've learned. I guess the one that's I've written down first is that we are so much better when we talk. And you might imagine that when we have offices open and people seeing each other every day, then the communication is great. We've been forced down this online route, and as a result, we've got wider and better communications. We're talking far more than we were as an organization. I think there is far greater interaction between our core teams. There is far more interaction across geographies, and that's both through formal events, but also the informal stuff, and that very much supports the well-being point that's been made by both Benedict and Philip. It's about people, but it also needs structure, and communications doesn't just happen. Flexibility doesn't just evolve. Collaboration is not something that springs out of nowhere, and having those processes there to make sure that people do talk, do communicate, have times in any given day to do that has been critical for us. I think generally we're kinder, and we are more forgiving of the people we deal with. And again, I think that probably does come back to Philip's point around the goodwill. We're all kind of in this together, no matter where we are, what part of the world we're in, or what business we're in, and we've been invited into our colleagues and our peers' homes, and we see that, and we see that this is not just the leader of a business, the slightly scary finance director. It's a father, it's a mother. They've got kids, they've got pets, they have a home they live in. And I think that's been a real positive. We trust more. We've learned, perhaps because we had to, that if we give people the tools to do the job right, most people will do their utmost to do a really, really good job. And I think that's been a really positive lesson that we've learned. We don't have to micromanage to the degree that we perhaps had a tendency to, and I use that in the broadest sense. Certainly it's something I've seen, but I think it's something we've seen across a number of businesses. So you know, these are the lessons that we've learned. Broadly speaking, I think as a risk professional, you've got to remember the core functions as well. This has been a crisis. This has been a lot of different challenges, but in there somewhere there has been the ongoing management of other risks. Yes, we've been talking about well-being. Yes, we've been talking about you know, enhanced mental well-being, travel, testing, quarantines. You know, we've talked about you know, how this is impacting on our colleagues, but we also have to look at the broader risks that we're facing in the world, the challenges that we have in a recessionary environment, and keeping our focus on that has been important. Managing claims. Thank you, Benedict, for reminding me of contingency claims, cancellation of events. I think we're all aware of the tennis tournament in southwest London that had the foresight to place, you know, comprehensive contingency cover. Hindsight is a marvelous thing. We were pleased that our insurance partners signed the checks when we had to cancel events this year, and we were appreciative of the support that we got from across the Lloyd's market, the composite market, the adjusters that worked through those significant claims that we had to deal with. I think looking forward, what we need to do is to not forget these lessons. It is going to be a different world. We are going to be operating in a potentially recessionary environment. We will hopefully get back together and be able to meet in person. But yet, let's use the tools we've learned to use better. Continue the collaboration. Continue to be kind. Trust good people. Don't overburden them with process. Yes, we need those processes in place, and yes, risk is something that needs to be managed. But spend the time listening and learning, and I think give people the freedom to do things because they're good, and they will. So that's kind of my kind of immediate take back on that. I'm conscious that we have a relatively limited time, and that Julia has some questions that she wants to put to the panel, and perhaps people out there have questions as well. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. David, that's incredible, thank you. And I think you brought together everything very nicely, because again, if we recollect Benedict's last slide, and I know we've shared the slides with our audience today, but a lot of what you were describing, David, in terms of better when we talk more, collaboration needs structure, and that we're kinder and we trust more. Actually, Benedict, a lot of those qualities of what you were talking about in your last slide that seem to have made their way through to the way that you're repurposing your business. Is that fair comment?
Yeah, I think it very much is. I think I would just add this rather than repeat. I think one of the great challenges will be acceleration, though. A lot of what we were doing, and I'm sure colleagues on the call would say the same with their own business. Those strategic plans were laid out. You know, we're undertaking a 5-year investment plan to digitize our business, but it's been accelerated in the last year. And actually, this pandemic has acted as a catalyst to my boss, who's the group CEO, Rohit Verma, said, well, why can I get something done in 6 months that you guys have been talking about for 2 years? And it was quite a eureka moment, actually. And I think the acceleration will be a key feature for resilience going forward. Plans moving to execution, that whole period will be transitioned a very shorter time frame than perhaps historically we would have seen in place.
Thank you, Benedict. Ludo, I'm sort of going to turn to you. There's a question about when you spoke at our seminar in September, and base that on some of your findings from your earlier report. And you've alluded this morning to perhaps one part of the world that's done a better job than some others. Have you seen any country performances change in the past 9 to 12 months? Are there countries that's made a great start in managing the pandemic and tailed off, and perhaps others that didn't make such a great start but have learned and have upped their game? Do you have any observations about performance and why that might be?
Well, they've been sort of certainly changes. I mean, the one country, there have been countries that have been sort of good throughout, and I think that's the benchmark, you know. And these things are actually, unfortunately, these are mostly Asian countries, and I would say I would rank New Zealand and Australia as part of that. I think, and part of the reason is that they had the memory of SARS, so they had integrated all of this with SARS. And then the COVID was sort of added on to that. So they were much further ahead on the learning curve, I think. So, you know, have these countries learned? Yes. Countries like, you know, the top leaders are New Zealand, Korea, Taiwan. So I think these are the benchmarks. And I think what is the most disappointing is that we know what needs to be done. And it's just a matter, in that sense, the typical business sentence is it's a matter of getting it done at the societal level. And that has not happened in the other countries for, you know, societal reasons, also for political reasons. I think that's been the issue. And now, in terms of deterioration, Singapore started beautifully and then forgot 300,000 sort of slave workers, you know, who were sort of all contaminated in the barracks. How could you forget 300,000 people, you know? And basically, they presumably all went through it. And then since then, of course, Singapore has become very conservative, but that's a country which I think started very well and then went worse. I think Germany has done well. Switzerland, where I live now since the last 10 years, started terrible, benign neglect, keeping the ski stations open, you know, and then actually corrected itself because they sent all the skiers home and then they locked. And then, you know, the ski season came up again and they're faltering again. So I think it's been a roller coaster. And I would say I don't see many countries gradually doing better, you know, in terms of doing it. I think the US, I think, is going to go through sort of an uptick, I think, because there will be more of a science-guided sort of policy, and I think that will help. I think the UK is changing its tack as well. So I think these are countries, but there's been a little bit of everything, and I would say overall insufficient learning during the pandemic at the political level. I think at the national level. I think that's what I would say.
Thank you, Lou. So thank you for that, Ludo. I think interesting observations about, as you say, winners and losers. And I won't put you on the spot and ask you what you think of the UK. I suspect we know the answer to that. But I'm going to look at Benedict and Philip for a specific here. A question we've come in is talking rather than at country level, let's go down into a sector level at the retail sector. So what do you think the experience of the pandemic might have on how the retail sector approaches resilience in the future? Have you come across retailers talking to you about how it's changing the way they run their businesses or how it's making them reflect? Do either of you have any observations from your travel journeys around your retail clients?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off that one if that's okay, Benedict. So yeah, I mean, and it's a really interesting point, because I think also, in addition to the pandemic, actually retail, especially in the US and perhaps Hong Kong, has been impacted by other issues around activism, rioting, and so on, which has meant that a number of the, you know, your sort of very high-profile retail stores in high-profile cities have had to close in addition to it. So I think retail has had a particularly large impact on both fronts. What we're seeing now is that, especially for larger global corporates, the challenge is that As we go into vaccination, you know, global corporates have footprints all over the world, and there's going to be a 2 or 3 tiered speed to vaccination, whereby first world countries are getting vaccinated very quickly, but you know, we've got lots of operations in developing countries who perhaps won't have a vaccine till later this year or maybe never. So I think what we're seeing is a real focus on the long term around retail operations or big global operations, understanding, putting in place things like global crisis centers or operations centers to make sure that as you know, the pandemic lasts or lingers, they can react specifically to key sites, either because of the pandemic or also down to other issues which could cause their retail sites to shut, and to draw the dots between those impacts and on their broader business from specific risk information using these operation centers. And that's if you've got the value and the resources to do that. But that's something we're seeing and a lot of trends for especially big brands.
Thank you. Julia, maybe
Yeah,
a few comments, but perhaps bring in here, maybe not specifically to retail. I've had a lot of close proximity with the hospitality trade in this in this pandemic management. But I think also we need to keep in mind that you know, this pandemic I think experience teaches us that even large companies with experienced risk management processes and business continuity plans, look, they can underestimate the complexity of the insurance claims process. And appreciate I'm back to insurance claims, but I do feel that it's, you know, it's acceptable to think you cannot prepare for every eventuality, but you can prepare the claims process. You know, the involvement of intangible assets, intellectual property, you know, just becomes so significant, and contingent BI, as you've seen, you know, through the whole civil litigation around BI, is just so significant that it does call upon risk managers, I think, to look at what the right resources are they have in their business, what are the right process, what are the right experts in place to derive, you know, a fair and pragmatic coverage and resolution to a claim. So speed is of the essence, and it's key to mitigation. And I think the resilient companies will have the ability to respond, as I say, rapidly and effectively. And I think for me, some of the key questions that has emerged from talking to risk managers and brokers in particular around this pandemic is, you know, is it known how your insurance policy will respond? What is it that you expect versus the reality? Do people really understand what is and what isn't covered? Has it been tested? You know, what are the chosen claims partners? What do you expect of them? What are your own capabilities and responsibilities and accountabilities within that framework? And have you rehearsed the team? Because I think reality suggests now that that will need to be, you know, frankly, a basic tool, a basic way of going forward to test these policies, because so many have been found wanting the policies, not the risk managers, I might add. And I do feel that whole area of loss mitigation and scenario planning will become much more relevant, but it's expensive and intensive to do, and I don't think it's just value add. I think it should become part of a core component of the claims world, and it needs to be paid for, I think.
Thank you, Benedict. And I'm sort of going to turn to David with the last question, because it segues from what you've just said. David, more testing, more rehearsing, or do you question the value? If you can give me a sort of short view on that. Okay. We'll take that as
so no, I don't question the value. No, I think it will provide an enormous amount of additional information to a business. Having sat on both sides, it's really, really hard to get the buy-in, not necessarily in terms of financial, but in terms of time from a business to put into that. And it's, you know, one of the things that's come out of this is people are looking and saying, oh yeah, bad things can actually happen, because for most people, bad stuff doesn't happen. Loss adjusted, it happens all the time, but you know, that's because that's your business. But for most businesses, you know, you're not suffering a major loss every day of the week. planning, scenario planning, pulling together teams of people, even for a day or half a day, is tough. And getting the buy-in is not easy. So I think it's something to be looked at. I think it's something that perhaps should be done as part and parcel of the renewal process, because that's where it should sit. You know, it's something that I think has to be driven by through the broking world, with the support of the skilled BI or other professionals. And yeah, always loved scenario planning. Think it's key, difficult to do.
David, thank you. I'm going to draw things to a close here. First of all, I'd like to thank our panel, Benedict, Ludo, Philip and David. Fantastic job, guys. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions today. Don't forget the papers that are available to you. Don't forget these upcoming events, which are on the screen in front of you. We haven't covered the insurance scene today, but I'd just like to remind you that the Supreme Court judgment on the FCA test case is being handed down on Friday. The FCA are into live streaming, believe it or not. They're going to live stream the judgment. There are a number of the firms that you deal with as Airmic members who are inviting you to briefings. We're going to be publishing a few thoughts on this ourselves when we've heard the download of the ruling on Friday as well. But do look out for that, because I think that's an incredibly important part of what's happening on our agenda this week. So thank you very much indeed, again, our panel. Thank you for my Airmic colleagues behind the scenes making today happen. And also very much thank you to those of you who've registered to attend today. We had a super turnout, nearly 80 people online. So that's a really great turnout. And thank you very much for joining us. I am sure this subject will again be broadcast in some shape or form over the coming year, but thank you to the panel for sharing your thoughts, and I wish you all a safe and a well day. Thank you very much indeed.